Hi, my name is Ken Lassesen. This is a technical introduction to myself for anybody who is interested, and it will hopefully give you a better perspective of what microbiome prescription is trying to do and how we got to where we are. Education-wise, I have a bachelor's honors in mathematics with concentration in probability and statistics. I have a master's of science in operations research with a minor in statistics. And I've been working on and off as a statistician for roughly 50 years, often dealing with non-customary issues. First major project I worked on was for a telco company in Canada, and it was trying to determine the quality of data for quality of service measurements, which had a bunch of interesting twists and turns to it because it also included having to do a data processing systems audit as part of the process, because the data system was how the information was gathered, so that had to be audited as well as the data. So apart from that beginning, my career has largely been in quote information technology, working for the likes of Verizon, original company, Microsoft as an employee, got a few patents there, Amazon, Starbucks, a whole bunch of small startups. Now, my interest in the microbiome started basically because of a condition I suffered from, actually repeatedly, commonly called by the name chronic fatigue syndrome, or ME. And one of the treatments which I ended up doing back in the year 2000 was rotating antibiotics. And that put me into full remission, which is, for chronic fatigue syndrome, a very rare event. The thing which happened was the explanation of what chronic fatigue syndrome was a occult rickettsia infection. And the word occult meant that you had to use special techniques in order to determine that. But there was some, how should I say, there was some gaps in the model, which, as a rather rigorously trained mathematician, wasn't making me happy. So when I had a relapse while working at Amazon, stressful company, and stress is a known trigger for chronic fatigue syndrome, I reread the literature, and because one symptom was different, I had to control all the other symptoms reasonably well and could keep working. But one symptom showed up which I had never had before, which was GI issue. So in rereading the literature, I mean rereading every single study on PubMed on chronic fatigue syndrome, so I got to really know the literature, came across a study from 1999 in Australia where they found there was a distinctive microbiome pattern for people with chronic fatigue syndrome. So I said, okay, that's interesting. I did antibiotics and that worked before. I wonder if that combination of antibiotics influenced the bacteria which were identified in the Australian study, and simply sat down and did a paper napkin computation of it, and lo and behold, if I wanted to alter the microbiome in the way which they had discovered the microbiome were altered in Australia, the antibiotics that I was on were the right ones. They inhibited the right species and they encouraged other species. In other words, wait a minute, okay, we have 1 plus 1. It looks like it adds up to 2. It's almost starting to quack like a duck and waddle like a duck. So with that, I ended up having a interesting hypothesis, and the hypothesis to me was very interesting for one real main reason. I was able to get antibiotics. It was not easy, especially since it's not a part of the standard of care for chronic fatigue syndrome. I had a sweet talked to the doctor for the first time around for the relapse. I actually sweet-talked the doctor, but she was shot down by her supervisor saying, no, you can't give antibiotics for chronic fatigue syndrome. Ended up going elsewhere, finding a doctor who was willing to, after giving me Lyme tests, which turned out positive, but that those tests are, how should I say, they are not the most reliable, because if you have Epstein-Barr virus infection in the past, and 70% of people do, you will typically get a false positive, because Epstein-Barr with chronic fatigue syndrome often will reactivate. So voila, the doctor, from her point of view, was covered because she had a lab test saying antibiotics potentially was warranted. So I got them. But the other thing was, with that realization, I went and discovered that something, that a probiotic my wife was taking for Crohn's disease, which was called Mutaflor, is a E. coli probiotic, which is made in Germany, being used since 1917, hence the name E. coli, initially 1917, because that's how long it's being out there. And E. coli was one of the things which the Australian study reported that chronic fatigue syndrome was low in, or alternatively, the bad E. coli was common. And the result was I had only 2 courses of antibiotics instead of the 10 courses I had before, and very rapid recovery because of it. That basically got me into saying, okay, so I'm lucky I've been able to do it. Most people with chronic fatigue syndrome are not able to go that path. The medical legacy doesn't encourage. So, can we do that using herbs, spices, diets, other things, which meant going over to PubMed and seeing what we could find in terms of the literature of what will change the same bacteria we were interested in the right direction. In other words, is the alternative to antibiotics perhaps slower, but it does the same effect, which is relevant for the condition, which is shift the microbiome. Now, being a classic academic, I found myself starting to gather the information and then realize I'm a data scientist. Lots of years of experience building data system. So why not simply drop the data into a database to make it much faster and easier to look up? And then everything that came along was a company called Ubiome with their samples. So the result was I could actually find out what was in my microbiome, confirm that if the shifts were the same, or if there was a slight variation of shifts. Because again, as a statistician, I know that a study of a group of samples doesn't mean that everybody has it. It means that the group as a whole has it, but there's considerable variation. So hence, having individual ubiome sample or microbiome sample was essential for selecting the appropriate items, and thereby started the process of writing in, encoding data into the database, and then the flip side of it was using that data to try to determine by optimization techniques. Remember, my master was in operations research optimization. So I knew what influenced which bacteria, lots and lots of different bacteria. I think I have 14,000 different bacteria in the uploads which people have done to the microbiome prescription site. So we're talking about some good sized data problem. And so the question was, okay, let's start putting it all together. So that was basically the beginning of the suggestion process. Now, with that I was also wanting to try to identify patterns. As a statistician, patterns is, let's just say, is my cookie and milk. So I just looked there, and what I discovered was that pattern finding, especially strong pattern finding in the microbiome, it's a real pain in the posterior. Quickly discover a couple of things. One is bacteria distributions for almost anything. It ain't normal distribution. It ain't a bell curve. Extremely skewed, which means what do? You shouldn't, correct, should not fall back to doing mean and standard deviation, because you are not going to get good results, because things are for some bacteria so extremely skewed. And so I ended up doing lots of different approaches to try to get the data to speak to me. I finally found some interesting approaches which really ended up getting some good results. Good results in a couple of things. A colleague who I was talking to mentioned a technique he used, which is a proprietary technique called the cutoff Maltrup approach, and that ended up giving me some very good bounds for when a microbiome becomes abnormal. And if a microbiome is a bacteria is abnormal, then that identifies which ones you want to change. So it gives you a criteria for selection, a mathematically based, which of course for me I'm happy with. Whether or not it reflects in clinical practice is a totally different question. And then continually go on and on and on, playing with the data and different methods of it, and then ended up discovering I could get some pretty good associations of one bacteria to another using some novel techniques. So the result was, oh, hey, wait, I'm trying to, how to say, I won't say I understand the microbiome. I understand how the modeling of the microbiome seems to work, and seems to work very well. So microbiome prescription is built on that. So ends up being a series of, generally one could refer to mainly proprietary, but there's also some standard one, like box whisker diagrams, make use of mean and standard deviation, all sorts of different ways of selecting which bacteria should be altered and focused on. Some cases for some people, there's only a handful of bacteria which are flagged. In other cases, we have literally hundreds of bacteria. Up to 40 to 50% of the bacteria were flagged as being potentially unusual, which ends up into some more interesting ways of having to take the problem apart. So, to cut my rambling a little bit shorter, one of the key questions dealing with this whole area, which anybody knows who does data science, is cross-validation. And here it's sort of interesting because I have a fair amount of good expertise and knowledge about the literature of chronic fatigue syndrome. I've read just about every single study out there published since the first days, probably 2, 3, or 4 times. I know the pattern, I know the literature. So when somebody uploads a sample who has chronic fatigue syndrome or something like that, I go in, run the program, look at the suggestion. What has happened over the last 3 or 4 years is I have tuned the optimization methodology so that the result of which is that, hey, the suggestion for this person through my program, which does not have an input, their medical condition, just the microbiome, comes up with a set of suggestions which are a very good match for what works in chronic fatigue syndrome in terms of clinical studies. Not the best cross-validation, but hey, wait a minute. If you're getting consensus between a pure computation on the microbiome and studies showing how microbiome shifts, which are coming from PubMed, and agreement with clinical experience with chronic fatigue syndrome, I am slightly tempted to jump out of the bathtub and run around naked shouting Eureka. And that's basically what has evolved here. These methodologies and techniques have kept growing and growing over time, or improving. A lot of dead ends, a lot of trying this approach and didn't go. Found a few approaches that did work and worked very nicely, and with those things, able to get consensus. Basically, let's put it simple, doing A, trying to regress against B, you can go and you get lousy results. You go and you try doing exponential B, lousy results, etc., etc., etc. And now wipe out. You do A, and then you do the right transformation of the data, a monotonic increasing function transformation. So in other words, things are in the same sequence, and suddenly you get strong correlations showing up. And you start going, okay, that's the mechanisms happening underneath. Or you don't know what the mechanism is, but you do know how they present themselves data-wise. So since they represent themselves data-wise, you can model it. Simple as that. Basic, how should I say it, in the mathematics thinking. And going on, a lot of it was trying to get the logic working out. Part of that was I happened to be one of these people who was involved early with artificial intelligence, taught at university level actually. And some of the techniques I ended up making use of was having to use fuzzy logic techniques in order to incorporate that in the algorithm. So the result was, okay, we have fuzziness, we have one study contradicting another study. How do we resolve it? How do we deal with the information? Do we totally ignore it, or do we work with it? I say we work with it. Better some knowledge, fuzzy knowledge, than no knowledge at all. So that's part of the process which has been slowly building up over the years, as in, I think, about 4 years now, maybe 5 years, very constant work every weekend, every evening on this sort of garage-based startup. So that's where we roughly are. I have a very high confidence that the mechanism are working with results far better than, I would say, most clinical suggestions for most MDs would do. A specialist may be able to outdo me if they know the conditions. But generally, if you're talking about family practice MD and things which they could suggest to the patient, forget it. They are often so random in their suggestion that they do more harm than good. And that has been experienced in chronic fatigue syndrome. Chronic fatigue syndrome, in one sense, is almost the ideal because it has a horrendous number of symptoms. And in terms of microbiome, you have a really, really complicated microbiome. The fact that it has been working, I have had people who have gone into significant improvement, and I think one to actually into full remissions too. Generally, when somebody ships in a microbiome, I do analysis, a walkthrough for them, as other blogs here. Usually what happens is a couple of days later, a couple of months later, more typically I get emails saying, hey, it worked. Example, or somebody I just got an email from Sweden who did it, and he felt horrendously good, high energy, etc. And he went pushing himself, fly fishing, something which he loved to do. So he was out there, good 2 days of fly fishing, and then he crashed. I'm not surprised he crashed, because with chronic fatigue syndrome, you cannot push it. But the fact that he had this degree of improvement convinced him that this is the approach to do. Him learning to discipline himself is what he has to go through. So that's the second side of it, which is sometimes having to do a little bit of patient education. Okay, with that roughly said, I think I've covered the main thing. To recap, personal experience, got me interested, discover a apparent agreement between a treatment and a study which had no apparent correlation with each other. They agreed. I proceeded to go and check the literature for things that help chronic fatigue syndrome, and check the literature where data was available. If those things, how those things alter the microbiome, found, wait a minute, we have a matchup, we have agreement. This thing to help chronic fatigue syndrome also shifts the microbiome in a favorable way back towards normal. And that just kept cascading and cascading and cascading. I'm not microbiome, not chronic fatigue syndrome specific. It's just that chronic fatigue syndrome is my gold standard because I can use that to validate algorithms, which is usually would be in this type of area would be a pain to figure out a way to validate, because you probably want to do a clinical study, and 5 years from now you may say, okay, we hit it or we missed it, we need to adjust it another 5 years. Since I know the literature of chronic fatigue syndrome and I'm getting lots of people volunteering their samples and pointing out they have chronic fatigue syndrome with symptoms, then away we go. Oh, speaking of symptoms, before I forget it, I find that the diagnosis is actually a very poor feed input. What you really want is a person's symptoms. The symptoms and the microbiome are far better associated than the diagnosis. And the result is, hey, you can work the diagnosis and you work the symptoms, or you can take both of them together. And when you take both of them together, you start getting some much more interesting associations, much stronger identification of which bacteria shifts seems to be the ones which are the main player. And sometimes you get some odd results. Like recently I did a look at long COVID and then compare it to its sibling, which is chronic fatigue syndrome. Guess what? And found that lab results were, well, the word frustrating would be how most people would describe it, because I compared 3 different lab results, and in those 3 different lab results we found that the shifts were different. Some cases the counts were higher than typical for people from that lab. Other cases they were lower than typical lab. In which ways they go as higher or lower? And if you actually read the studies, you find that the studies are indicating that some cases the shifts are higher for some conditions and lower for other, and that probably could be a result of which lab they are using and which software they're using. However, what I did find, which was absolutely fascinating, is that the percentile of detection of certain bacteria was consistent across the labs, as in, just as a beautiful example I saw was in the whole population of a whole 0.5% of people had this bacteria. People with long COVID or chronic fatigue syndrome, we had 20% having this bacteria. But with a gotcha, the number of that bacteria was lower than that of the population. Which means that it's not because of the abundance of that bacteria that's causing it, it's because of the existence of the bacteria. So now you almost get into an existential analysis. But the results were, I found, surprisingly strong, or shockingly strong, which ends up having to do a very different shift of how to look at the microbiome, which I'm slowly working through. Okay, that's so much for future results, but that basically describes me. Academically trained, inquisitive, diligent, able to assemble data, partially because I happen to be a high autism person, so I end up having an notorious ability to super focus and doggedly going after things, which is what I've been doing, and that other function of high functionality is the ability to handle a high degree of complexity without breaking out into a sweat. So other people get saturated or bored. The high functionality autism allows me to, let's just keep going. Okay, let's I think it's almost the equivalent of having a photographic memory, but in a different sense. But again, it's an autism characteristic. So with that said, I'll stop my rambling, and that should give you a good introduction as to who I am and what I'm trying to do. Basically trying to help people be better using the microbiome data and being able to construct suggestion lists which are more likely to help them to reduce their symptoms, be more specific, than to hurt them. So that's it. Have a good day.